So we decided as well, we didn't really want this to be a sort of panel. Gareth kept saying it was like a fireside chat, so we thought we'd do this. It'll play in a minute. It'll play when it catches up. Don't worry.
Yeah, I was persuaded it was fireside chat.
Fireside chat.
That was the reason I did it, actually.
But then we thought even though they won't stop talking in a minute, I have to say I'm a lampy, right? So these may not be your perfect sound questions. You get a chance later. But where I thought we'd start with Starlight, because the thing that interested me, and it's a question to both of them, is sort of both of them fell into musical theatre sound from slightly other places. Martin was really a recording engineer. Gareth was really a lifeguard, I think, but that's a whole other story. Lifeguard,
right,
yeah.
Sorry.
Marine biologist. But both of you, what were you trying to bring to musical theatre to move it on from where it had been when you arrived, I guess is the question.
No, I think you should go first.
Okay.
Because I know what your answer is, and it's more interesting than mine.
I don't know. I mean, I didn't really have a vision of where I wanted to take it to. I was just asked to make it sound good, and that's what I tried to do. I didn't really have a sort of, oh my God, it's been like this, we've got to move it to something else.
But the thing is, everybody says about you that you came into musical theatre with this idea that you were going to revolutionise sound and make it like recording studio in a theatre. And in the conversations we've had, you were like, absolutely, that was never my intention.
Well, the phrase of me bringing studio sound into the theatre was never coined by me. And it was never really my concept for it at all.
But yeah, it's what you've been known for.
But I had my 10, 11 years of experience in the studio first. So I did have good knowledge of how microphones sounded, how speakers sounded, how desks sounded, how equipment sounded, And I had that in a very controlled environment, rather than an environment where you're getting a lot of live sound and noise around and everything. So I probably had a bit of a good starting point of knowing what was coming down the wire, basically. Which I think at the time, a lot of the designers probably didn't have, because they were always dealing with a combination of things, combination of sounds. But I was just brought into it because a particular person was unhappy with how shows were sounding.
Okay.
Can you all hear okay, by the way? Everyone hear okay? Yeah, great. In my case, I went to see a production of Woman in White that Mick Potter had designed. And it was the first time I'd ever felt like I was sitting inside an orchestra. And what Mick had done, it was really quite simple, but it's not something I'd experienced at the time. He'd put in a surround system that only came from behind you, and then he'd put the orchestra reverb into that. Basically, that's all he'd done. He'd also added some light synth pads, some string pads into the surround. And I'm sitting there in the middle of the orchestra, and it was a bit of an eye-opening moment for me. And what I guess I've become known for is a term that I have coined, I do take responsibility for, which is this idea of bringing cinematic sound design to musical theatre. It's a sound design that's unapologetic about there being sound, and certainly for a long time, sound in theatre was all about being invisible, because that's what people wanted. It kind of still is like that in opera world, and I just kind of decided I was going to stop apologising for it, and we were going to see the microphones, we were going to see the speakers, and we were going to have sound that, if we needed a spaceship to fly over, it was going to shake the floor. If we needed timpanis, it was going to rattle the windows. We were going to put everyone in the middle of the orchestra. That was my take on stuff.
It's a sign. I was the one who was saying don't go off topic, but I'm now going to. Do you think that change is also necessary because the audience has changed? Like, are they more used to that in all the other environments? We need to go along with that now, do you think?
I don't know the answer to that, really, to be honest, because
certainly what you're doing in the studio, that's what people are now listening to on their home hi-fi systems.
Not many people on hi-fi systems, mostly on phones and laptops.
But it's all so much more high fidelity than it ever was.
Yes, that is very true.
I think there's definitely a change in expectations.
Okay.
I think there's a change in expectations as to what people expect to hear. And I think the quality of the audio delivery systems that most people have in their houses.
And do you think also because in your house you can just make it what you want it to be, that you expect
I think there's more. I think there's probably more of a change in what people think musical theatre is, actually, as to the sound itself. Because, historically, musical theatre was very much about the real performance of the people and the actor-audience relationship in the building, and that sort of being together in the same room sense of early theatre. I'm guessing a little bit because it's well before my time. And now, and not all shows, because obviously there are still plays, there's still shows that do work at a more acoustic level, but there's a lot of shows that need to be loud, and those shows people expect to see a multimedia performance, a little bit more like a concert.
But also, because the shows have changed, you can't do that in the same way. So, for example, if you look at the original choreography for something like Carousel, the leading lady would stop, walk down stage, stand at the very front edge of the stage and sing.
Yeah.
And then there would be a choreographical interlude. She'd stop singing, she'd do the dance, she'd step back to the front edge of the stage again. Choreographers don't do that anymore. Choreographers are like, okay, we're going to have a full-blown dance moment while we're also singing. It also used to be that we had such big, well, you have, I've never had this, but you had such big orchestras that if you needed a flute line to soar out the orchestra pit, then the 3 flute players all played the same notes at the same time. Whereas now I'm lucky to have 1 flute, which means that if we need that flute line to pop out, it's got to be mixed. It's got to be electronically enhanced. And I think orchestrators and arrangers know they can do that because they know that they don't need 3 violins. They don't need 3 violins to make that violin lead part pop out the mix.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I don't remember the numbers, but Starlight, from counting the desks downstairs, there's a lot of orchestra. And Starlight now, there's rather less orchestra.
How many have you got in the band? Starlight?
We've got 8 now and a lot of click track.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas you must have been, what, triple that? Double that?
Well, probably double that. I think it wasn't huge then.
And what did you have in the way of tracks? You had like those race loops and stuff, right?
No. It's a memory test, by the way, this afternoon for me. It was 40 years ago. So there's someone in the audience I might point at. I might get cribbed a few answers.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly a lot bigger than it is now.
The only playback we had on Starlight was the voice of control. As far as I know.
Which is ironic because we've got rid of that. We've now got a real voice of control.
And that's reversed.
Yeah.
And all the sound that moved around the building, moved around the theatre, around the tracks.
So that was all live?
That was all live. All that was done.
So how
live.
did you do that? Because these days, if I want to do that, I get a piece of software like PanLab or I use Soundscape and I just draw a circle and it follows it.
If you come downstairs later, we can show you
is the donut here?
The thing.
The donut's here, is it?
Yeah, I didn't see it. I just saw it. Looked at it.
Hidden away.
Is it okay?
Special
Okay.
guest.
In case
only.
someone steals
All
it.
right.
Yeah, we. How did we do that? Well, we had speakers all around the tracks, hanging around the tracks. I think we had a dozen downstairs, maybe, and 8 upstairs. I can't remember exactly. Just positioned around the tracks, and all we did is we moved. Pretty much the only thing we moved around there was the reverbs of the brass section.
Okay.
We had real brass.
Yeah.
And we just panned the reverb of that brass with the skaters.
So you automated the auxiliary. You automated.
We didn't
the
automate it at all. It was done on a big knob
Okay.
that was called a donut. And it was designed and built by a chap at Autograph, whose name escapes me.
Must have been pretty
Phil.
smart. Must have been pretty
Anyone
smart.
know? No, it might have been Phil, 40 years ago.
There's a lot of Phils in sound. It probably was Phil.
And again, the technology of the day, as I understand it, it was a bunch of light sensing photoelectric cells,
Yeah.
basically. And it had a disc, I think an aluminium disc or metal disc, with diamond shapes cut in it, and he panned it round, exposing the cells between the speakers. And the shape of the diamond cutout was the fade between the 2 speakers. It was all very primitive.
But it's got a great. There's a guy downstairs yesterday who came up to us and was trying it. It was like, I can't get one that feels this good. How much does it cost? So it's priceless,
Well, there's only one.
obviously.
It probably
if you have
costs
the
a lot
right-
of
I'm
money,
sure there's
I would
somebody
think.
from Autograph in here who can sell you one if you really want it.
No one can. Well, I don't know. There's no one from Autograph here, is there?
I mean,
Not from 40 years ago, anyway.
My related question, I guess, and it's interesting, all these conversations which are about partly what we might call the art side and partly the technology. But in what we do, they're all interrelated because you can't achieve one without the other. So if afterwards you come downstairs, Classically Alive at the back of the hall, you will find the original Starlight Express mixing console, which is a custom-made.
I think we're going to go down.
We're going to hang out there.
We're gonna
Hang out
afterwards.
afterwards.
So come and join us. But my question is, so it was custom-made. It's my understanding as a lampy is it's the first one to establish the way shows are now mixed, which is a computer routes the faders to a VCA, so the operator just stands here. rather than having to chase all over the desk. And again, my understanding is some of that was necessary because this was the first show where pretty much everybody wore a radio mic all the time.
Yeah.
And they also wore them here.
On their
somewhere.
helmets and all sorts of places.
First time. But my question is how persuasive do you have to be to get somebody to invest in that for you? And how do you then figure out in advance what you then need? How do you turn your vision into that reality, I guess? If you can remember.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm the first one to admit that I was probably in quite a privileged position, really, being brought into the theatre by Andrew Lloyd Webber to make his shows sound better than he thought they were sounding before. And with his support, on a good day, with his support, I was able to really ask for what I needed. I just had to think of what it was I wanted. I knew a desk designer from my studio days, a chap called Clive Green, who was the MD at Cadac, and he used to make custom consoles for studios. And I went to him and asked him if he'd make a desk for the theatre. And Starlight wasn't the first desk.
We had the other one last year.
Did you? Okay,
Yeah.
the coffin you had last year, yeah. But this was the first automated desk, or attempt at an automated desk. And not all the automation worked, actually. We had more automation than we actually used in the show, because some of it didn't function properly. We did try to automate fader levels as well as VCA grouping, but that was not a success.
So there were motorised faders in that original desk?
There were VCA faders.
Right.
So they're all VCA type faders, which would have been a pain anyway if it hadn't worked, because you'd have to have moved the fader to a null point to pick up the level it was before it took over
so you
again.
put it to the null, then moved it and stored it.
Yeah, so you'd have little lights to show you where it was, but it used to creep. When we tried, it was only built at the last minute, and it used to creep every time you saved a setting. It was like half a dB out, so you did it 10 times, now you were 5 dB out, you know, and just used to creep. So we had so much to do, as you know, when you're putting a show on, so we just dumped that and went with the VCA grouping.
So was the concept that the operator could pay more attention if they would just hear? Because that's
Well,
the way
it
it is
wasn't so
now.
much that to pay attention. It was so they could. It was an instrument, you know, without computers. It was very much an instrument for the operator to perform on. And if you're dashing about all over the place, it's very hard. You know, if you can reach everything you need.
You know, it's got to have a 32 by 32 delay matrix, and you've got to have these digital messaging screens, and it's got to be able to automate this and automate that. But fundamentally, in order to actually do musical theatre sound, there's two things it needs to be able to do: mute things and reassign the DCAs on cue. If it can do those two things, you can do a theatre show with it. Might not be a great theatre show, but you can do it. And there's a lot, most of the old analog desks, most of the medium age analog desks, like Heritage 3000, will do that.
Yeah. Actually, thinking back, my memory's coming back as I speak about it, of course, a little bit. Centralising it wasn't the prime reason for doing that in the day. My prime reason for doing that was that I had an orchestra. In this instance, they weren't in a pit; they were under the stage, invisible to the audience. The original intention was to be able to route out from the desk individual instruments of that orchestra to different parts of a sound system. So
we had doing like a kind of A, B, C,
well,
D.
it was an A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H.
You're trying to make an orchestra.
So this...
Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 12. I think we had 12 different speaker positions on stage for the band.
So this is 12 individual speakers in the back wall, basically?
Basically 12 individual speakers in the back wall.
Yeah.
And from the matrix, you could route the band to 1 or 3 of them or 10 of them or whatever you wanted to do. You could create a stereo across the back. You could put a guitar half left and just have it in one speaker. So you could really have the band coming out of almost individual speakers.
The phase benefits of that must have been superb, right?
Huge. Yeah, huge. I mean, in a sense, that's where I wanted to take it after that, but it was impossible to really develop that.
I had this idea ages ago that you could build a whole proscenium out of small speakers, like 20 speakers of a proscenium each side, and just put different instruments or a different person in each speaker, and you'd have no phasing. It sounds like you were doing that 25 years before I'd even
That was the main reason for doing it on Starlight originally, as a
But what did you do about the vocals? That was a completely separate system.
I was trying to remember that as I was looking at the desk downstairs.
The drawings are downstairs. We can go figure it
in
out
case you
later.
hadn't noticed, we don't have an auto prompt.
No, the vocals just went out to a separate vocal system as far as I remember. There are 2 routing buttons for the vocals. I can't remember why. But they went out to a basic vocal system. No AB stuff.
There was no AB because the
No.
AB stuff you didn't do the AB stuff until it wasn't the first Phantom, was it?
No.
It wasn't. Wasn't it?
It wasn't the
Sunset
second
Boulevard.
Phantom either.
Was it Sunset Boulevard? Was the AB?
No. The first, sort of half the first AB system was on a little show called Carrie, which was rather famous for being one of the biggest flops in New York. Albeit a fantastic
but with the
show.
first use of an AB system in,
It was the first use of an AB system in New York, I think. I think it was. In New York.
But you used it before in London because you invented the AB system, right?
Yes, we did.
Okay. Also invented the idea of putting microphones on people's heads, by the way. Just catalogue of things.
A catalogue of catastrophes. Yeah, the AB system, I don't know if I ever told you this, Gareth, I don't know, came about...
Tell me again now if you
It came
have.
about by chance, actually. We were doing a show called Carrie. You may or may never have heard of the show. You've probably heard of the film. You may not think it's the right thing to do a musical of, but lots of blood, lots of dead pigs and things, you know. And,
Sounds like a winner.
It was great. I loved it. It was a really good show. Anyway, where was I? Good show. We're up in Stratford. It was a combined RSC and a producer from Germany production. And my very good friend Graham Carmichael, sadly passed away, not with us now, was working on it with me. He was operating it and helping me, assisting me as a designer. And it was quite a pop, kind of almost a kind of pop musical, a bit like the ones you do now, but
I think
not
I've heard
not
the
as
story.
big. And
Only once, but I think I've heard.
It's kind of fun stuff.
Probably due for revival sometime soon.
So there were quite a lot
Please
of
don't suggest it.
in those days loud scenes, not loud now, but loud scenes in those days, kind of rock.
You notice how he keeps looking at me every time he says loud, like loud now, right?
So like rock pop scenes, and there were some very, very intimate scenes with the mother and the daughter on the stage, very, very semi-acoustic, much more intimate scenes. So I put 2 systems in the theatre. They weren't an AB system.
It was a band and vocal system.
No, we had a rock and an acoustic system. That's what we called them.
Okay,
That's because
yeah.
we had to call them something. And we had an automated CADAC. We could switch from system to system, etc., etc. So you come from a rock scene into I'd call it an acoustic scene. Of course, it wasn't acoustic. It was partially amplified. And we'd move the vocals from whatever we were using for the rock system. I can't remember what they were. They weren't Mayors. It was something else. And some open tannoys.
We should tangent on the open tannoys because half the people in this room will not know what open tannoy is.
Okay. So we had an acoustic and a rock system.
We'll come back to the open tannoys.
So it's a bit of a long story, this, isn't it?
keep
But
going.
He did ask.
He did ask.
He did ask. So we're in rehearsal, and we flip a cue, and they want to go into the acoustic system. We do the mother-daughter scenes, and we flip a cue, go back into the rock scenes, and then we flip a cue. You know. Anyway, at some point, there was a duet with the mother and the daughter as an intimate scene. And normally, in the day, when you've got mics up here, you've got people really close together singing. You get a lot of phasing on stage, so you're riding the faders like this all the time.
This is not an in-the-day thing, by the way. This is still a massive problem for us today.
Okay, we'll talk about
still
that.
a thing.
So you're riding the faders all the time to try and get round it. And while I was talking to Graham, he was mixing, and he'd forgotten to ride the faders, and we were talking to him, and he had both the faders up, and we suddenly looked up. They're not phasing. What's happened? They're not phasing. I looked at him, he looked at me, and I looked at him. I thought, what's happened? And he'd missed the cue. So one of them was still in the rock system, and one of them was still in the acoustic system. So we thought, eureka, we've found it. And that's how it happened. It was an accident, basically. And it was so obvious at the time why it did it, because we're generating
It must have been, as soon as you realised what happened, it must have been a complete,
It was a complete moment that you knew everything about the future of it at that point, because you're generating the sound, the point source from 2 different places. And, all right, it doesn't 100% fix the phase.
It's
95% fix the phase. With a little bit of acoustic sound that we had in those days, it really does fix the phase. And that was the moment. So after that, all the shows went to AB systems.
And did you ever evolve to the point of splitting the orchestra across the AB systems?
Oh, we did that all the
everything
time.
Everything was
We
split
did that
across?
all the time. You know, you'd have 6 fiddle, well, luxury in those days, 6 violins in the pit or something, and you'd have a mic on each one, and you put one in the A system, one in the B. And when you do a sound check, you go through the mics. First mic, okay, A system, B sounds better in the A. Next one sounds better in the B, and you just pick the one that sounds best, and you mix the orchestra up completely in the two systems.
So years later, and it would be 20 years later, I tried to reproduce the way Martin was doing this. And I did all my research and worked out how to do it. And I was really quite pleased with myself that I'd effectively recreated Martin's original AB system. I was quite proudly telling him about this. And I was like, and I even figured out how you used to do the reverbs. You'd have 2 separate reverb engines, one for the A system, one for the B system for vocals, and one for the band, and one band for the A system and one band for the B system. And he was like, yeah, which system did you send them to? And I was like, oh. And I realized that what I was doing was, okay, all the vocals are in, half the vocals are in the A system, half the vocals are in the B system, and the A vocals get the A reverb, which goes to the A system, and the B vocals get the B reverb, which goes to the B system. And Martin's like, no. It's the other way around. And I was like, ah! And so, like, even decades later, I'm still learning things. I'm just sitting talking shit with Martin in a bar, and I'm like, and that's what's so fascinating about it. You all discovered these things that we all do all day, every day. I mean, front fills across the front edge of the stage, I think was Martin. Microphones on heads, AB system, and the Tannoy Naked Lady speakers, which we don't use anymore. But for those of you who didn't have the pleasure of this was a Tannoy V300 driver, 38.
Forget the numbers. They went through different ranges. A 15-inch, basically, dual concentric.
15-inch dual concentric driver that Martin took out of the cabinet, put it in a metal frame, and hung it in free space. And the idea was that the sound came out the front and the sides and the back and bounced off all the walls and excited the room. And with the kind of amplification that Martin was trying to do, it was to raise the level of voices rather than make it absolutely direct line array drivers pointing straight in your face. And again, that was the standard. I mean, Mike Walker's in here at the back. Mike was doing this relatively recently. This is still an idea that is still being used. That technology was still on Phantom
I think Steve
London.
Kennedy's still doing it in New York a bit. I don't know. Sometimes.
I did something with Steve not very long ago where he was playing with that kind of stuff. And Phantom London, up until the refit, was still that stuff as well.
I mean, interestingly, the concept for doing that came out of when we were trying to design the sound for Phantom. Again, with Graham as my assistant. It was at my house actually. One of the initial briefs that Andrew gave me when he very first got me involved. He says, "It always sounds like it comes from over by the speakers. I want it to come from where they're singing." You know, the old thing. You've got a good way of doing it now.
He still says that.
Does he? Okay, well, you've got a different way of doing it. But we were dealing with some live sound. So I just played around with some different speakers at home, and I had some Tannoy 15-inch drivers, and I played with them and listened to them out of the box and heard how they focus the sound. And the actual sense of space around them, allowing you to feel that the original source, if it's timed correctly, is the source, was better than it was in a box.
Didn't you have
it was also completely uncoloured because it's out of a box as well.
Didn't you have a headroom issue with the microphones? You're using MK2s at this point, right?
Yes, on Phantom.
Yeah.
How long have we got? That's a long story.
A few minutes.
Okay.
Now, and if you're going to go in a radio mic story, you've got to talk about Starlight Express
always downstairs
London.
later.
I mean, if you're going to do a radio mic story, you've got to talk about Starlight Express London opening night, surely.
All right, well, yeah, many of you may or may not know about the Starlight opening night fiasco. In the day, there was only 6 frequencies legally allowed for use in theatres. It's actually a band, I think, but they were able to get about 6 frequencies going. And of course, Starlight, obviously, we needed to mic everyone. So I think we had 20 mics.
Yeah, I just gave a quick count on that desk downstairs, and
think it was
22 on that, but they probably added a couple.
Yeah, and so we were using the legal frequencies and the open frequencies, if you like. So these are frequencies that anyone can use. They're not illegal, but they're open to the world to use. And we had 2 weeks of completely clean previews, which the other departments, I have to say, didn't quite have 2 weeks of clean previews, but we all got there in the
totally
end.
under the radar.
Yeah, we had fantastic clean preview for 2. And then halfway through Act 1 on the opening night, suddenly one of the radios just sort of did the traditional, oh, what was that? Look at the desk. And it cleared. And it started again. And cut the story short, during the show, we lost most of the radio mics. Virtually no radio mics worked.
And this was
for
like
most of the
6
show.
o'clock news on the BBC kind of news. This was such a big deal. Andrew Lloyd Webber's new show, Starlight Express, all the radio mics died. I mean, just imagine for a second, we've all screwed things up. Imagine seeing it on the 6 o'clock news. I mean...
So Andrew Bruce, who's been production sound on Starlight, started going outside.
I was just saying, is there. Andrew Bruce is lurking.
Is Andrew Bruce lurking around?
Yeah, there he is. Yellow jumper at the back there.
He's made it, yeah. Hi, Andrew. Very kindly, or whatever. Anyway, he saw the spike. He knows the story better than I do, actually.
Yeah.
So I don't know. He should be up here telling it.
Tell it downstairs. You can tell his version downstairs.
Yeah.
Later.
So he just saw this spike on the analyzer, like 50 times as big as the spikes of our mics, and so he ran out in the street trying to find out what was going on. And I think it was his second attempt out in the street to find out what's going on. Found a BBC remote truck out there broadcasting back to base, testing.
Because it was that bigger news, Andrew Lloyd Webber's new musical.
And they
London.
were doing a Kaleidoscope, I think it was. Yeah, he's nodding at me. No, it wasn't Kaleidoscope. It was something. Anyway, they were doing a show, interviewing people coming out after the show. They were testing the link, So he got them to turn it off during Act 1. And they said, right, we'll shut it down then, just messing you up. But of course, they put it back on in Act 2 because they're getting ready to broadcast. So it completely kind of screwed up. But
I imagine the BBC was like, I'm legal.
well, what happened
You're
was
not.
one of the reviewers, I think it was the Times, Financial Times, put in there about the BBC screwing up the sound of Starlight, and the BBC weren't happy about that, of course. And there was a big furore about it, and
This led
subsequent to that, it led to the
of
creation of the frequency, which I think Andrew Bruce here was very instrumental in putting us together.
Yeah,
and
so that was
getting
the
together.
nexus of the creation of licensing of radio
Yeah,
rights.
I think they had to take theatre seriously, and it had a very positive effect. But it was not a nice night.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It was a very unpleasant evening.
Well, I have a question that, out of order, but my question from later that I'll just throw in now because it's perfect is, again, any of the designs in theatre is one part art, one part technical, and then I think it's probably all 8 parts politics. And so my question based on that, and generally, because you two, I suspect, are both really good at all of these bits, but particularly the politics. And I don't want horror stories about particular producers or people, but just for the people in the room, how do you deal with the politics of getting the show on, sound getting the time and money and priority it needs, when somebody comes and yells at you, when it all is a really bad night? How do you deal with that?
Do you want to go first?
I think the thing that I've learned is that there are a lot of people in the room who have opinions about sound, and the default sound engineer's default position is to always assume everyone else is wrong and that you're right because you're the sound engineer. And what I've realized is that there's an awful lot of people who have really valid opinions about how shows should sound. And what I feel like I've got good at over the years is taking everybody's notes, taking everybody's input and distilling it down into one cohesive final product. And there are very few people's notes or very few people's opinions that I dismiss completely out of hand. I will take everyone's thoughts, process it, think about it. Do they have a point? Well, my wife's boyfriend's sister's cousin said it's too loud in the back of the gallery. Well, maybe it is too loud in the back of the gallery. Maybe we should get up there and check it. Also, you've got people like composers and orchestrators and arrangers. Some of them have been living with these shows for years and years. They have opinions about how the show's supposed to sound. Most of the time, I don't start paying serious attention to these shows until a week before tech starts. I'm not arrogant enough to assume that I know better as to how a show should sound than the person who's been composing it for the last 5 years. So I think the thing that I've found, the best skill set that I've found is to be very willing and open to taking other people's opinions. Be it one of my crew who's popped in from a show to somebody, a lighting person from another show, anyone. I'm interested in hearing what they have to say. Doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to do anything about it, but I want to know all of these things so that I can take it into one cohesive pot, mix it all up, and make sure that I'm not missing anything. I think that's probably my biggest political thing that I've learned to help.
I have to ask, how often when Andrew's standing next to you, a composer is standing next to you, do you put the fader up and then when he walks away you just put it back down again?
This seminar is being recorded, and there's absolutely no way I'm going to discuss that. And I'm also already in trouble with the lawyers over the royalties, so I'm totally not bringing this up.
And it's not a simple answer, actually.
No.
It's not a simple answer, because often they're right. Because they see something you haven't seen, because they've composed it, and you're seeing it, second hand, as it were. So they are often right. So you have to take that on board. But
the thing about, we keep the subject of Andrew keeps coming up because we're talking about
other producers. Other producers are available.
If you take Andrew as an example, he's very rarely wrong. If he's got an idea about something, he's very rarely wrong. He just may not be expressing it in a way that necessarily makes sense, and that is often the problem with musicians talking to sound engineers. Musicians will often explain things in a musician-y type way, and sound engineers need to know, well, actually, I think you need 3 dB less 240 hertz in the bass guitar. And learning to interpret that, you don't have to be a musician. And actually, sometimes being a musician as a sound engineer is detrimental, but an understanding of music theory and an ability to talk to composers and musicians in their own language, that's highly beneficial.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, really. When you said political, whether you meant in the theatre, getting the sound together, or whether doing your contracts and all that sort of stuff, it's all political, But
I think we talked about contracts enough.
No, you're in trouble. You're definitely in trouble.
So are you. No, I brought it out.
Maybe,
okay.
Maybe. Where was I? Political. I'm the same as pretty much the same as Gareth, actually. Of course, everyone's opinion is worth something. You have to listen. You have to take it on board. But at the end of the day, you're there to do a job because of your particular skill and particular talent.
And you're the one who's going to be judged on it.
You're the one who's going to be judged on it too. And maybe it was fortune that kept me going through it all, I don't know. But I pretty much decided what I wanted to do with the sound, and I would just take everything on board, and if I thought it wasn't relevant, I'd ignore it. And if I thought it wasn't helpful, I'd ignore it. And if I could bring it into my design, I would do it. But I would stand very firmly. I would never concede anything in my design for someone else that I thought wasn't right, if I could possibly help it. I wouldn't say it's 100%, but I would always stand. And then if the end result is great and everyone loves it, everything's forgiven. Because the end result is really what they're after.
I also think the integrity of the sound system is really important when it comes to what we're talking about here, which is you need a sound system that really does sound the same everywhere in the theatre, because the best and quickest way to lose the trust of the music team is if the composer says to you, hey, I think the bass guitar is really loud, and then the orchestrator who's sitting 5 seats to the right goes, I couldn't hear the bass guitar at all. And suddenly, everyone's looking at you like, well, what do you think about the bass guitar? And I'm like, I don't know, it sounded fine where I am. And then the orchestrator's like, well, I don't know what you're crazy. I couldn't hear the bass guitar. So having a system that you can trust, that knowing that when you're standing behind the mixing desk, the composer's in the third row and the orchestrator's in the circle, knowing that they're all hearing the same thing, that's really important to being able to make judgment calls when people give you notes. Because if you don't have that, then you don't have a flat basis, a flat foundation to start with.
So I think if we push our luck a bit, we've probably got about 10 minutes left in 6 minutes left. I'm just going to round it up. But as I say, please come and join us downstairs afterwards. But if we have the question you want, if you have questions, you can ask them downstairs, but if you want the question you want to share with the room, now would be a good time to ask it. Just wave your hand, because there's a gentleman with a microphone. If you come down here on the right, or go the long way round. You might just also have to talk loudly, because we're not wearing your Cybermen headphones.
You mentioned wanting cinematic sound. I've been to 2 shows that you've designed, and I've seen that they've had Avid desks. Why?
Okay, I have to be really careful about this because I am a shareholder in Audiotonics that builds Digico. So I have to be really careful what I say here. I have done quite well out of being involved with companies where I am the lone voice in the room dictating how they work when it comes to the job that I need to do. So in the early days, in the early part of my career, I was using Amec Recall mixing desks, and they were falling apart. You know, it was the one with the Rupert Neve voice that spoke to you, and they were falling apart, and the pots were getting noisy, and I needed a replacement console. And the Digico D5 had come out, but it was really expensive. I actually did some work with Andrew Bruce on the original D5, but it was really expensive, and the shows I was doing, they just couldn't justify the cost of the Digico D5. And Avid bought out the original Venue console at around the same time, and it was a lot cheaper, and it didn't tick any of the boxes that people would have said it needed to tick in order to be a theatre desk. It only had 8 VCAs. At the time, we were all like, you got to have 16 VCAs. It had an 8x8 matrix, 8x8 mono matrix, in fact, and you know that was just didn't tick any of the theatre boxes. But they also, because it didn't tick any of the theatre boxes, none of the theatre sound designers were interested in it. So I ended up building up a relationship with Avid where I was the sole voice saying, hey, this is what I need it to do for theatre. So I got to dictate, to some degree, how the snapshot system would work, how the automation would work, and how all of that kind of thing would work for what I needed it to do. So what I actually ended up with in the modern S6L console, which is supremely powerful and indeed easily as expensive as any of the Digico desks, I ended up with a desk that was basically my invention and did exactly what I wanted it to do. It's nothing to do with any of the other consoles not being able to do things or not being good enough. It's that I kind of got to make the Avid do exactly what I wanted it to do.
Okay, any more? Oh, sorry to make you run all the way around the room.
It's going to get very
Oh,
thick.
we might need,
I
you're a
can-
long way away. We might need to headphone up for this one.
So you mentioned earlier on about headroom with the open tannoys and the head mics, but you didn't actually go back on that. I was just wondering if there was a little bit more that you could enlighten us about on that one.
That's me, isn't it? Yes, it's me.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't so much the headroom with the tannoys actually. It was headroom of the new little small microphones that were available that were able to put in.
Hidden right in the hair. Yeah.
They were hidden in the hair. This was an idea. Actually, Andrew Bruce might be able to remember exactly when we did this. I was trying to think last night whether
wasn't the original guinea pig for this? Wasn't it Siobhan? Andrew's
It
wife?
was, yeah. We went to a studio, Audio International then it was called, with Andrew and Siobhan, and tested all sorts of different positions around the head and the face, and measured sound pressure levels and things to see where would be a good place to put a microphone. I just can't remember whether it was before Starlight or after Starlight.
Well, Starlight, you weren't.
Before Starlight. Okay, there you go.
But also with Starlight, weren't you doing a sort of boom thing with it built into the headphone head? And
So we'll
into
come
the
back to
helmet
the question in a second.
Okay, right.
But yes,
Sorry.
so we were.
This is what happens when we start talking. I'm
The
sorry.
first production meeting for Starlight, Trevor Nunn was directing, obviously Andrew's show, a bunch of people at the production meeting. Came to my turn to speak, what we're going to do with the sound. And I said, well, my first opening sentence was, it's going to be a loud show, people on roller skates, we're going to probably have to use booms. And they've really just begun to be used in the kind of pop concert world.
So you're thinking about those bloody great big crown things? Was
Well,
that
no,
even
it was,
right?
not huge,
Yeah, but that's
but a
like-
boom,
But there's that thing that everyone, whenever you say to a director, I'd really like to use boom mics, they always go, they always think of that
Well, he
massive
did,
black Janet Jackson
He
type
did, I
thing.
think, because he immediately said,
Yeah,
no,
that's
stop.
That's what.
Mics have to be invisible. We cannot see any mic. But no mics, So I played that political game rather badly, and we weren't allowed to use booms at all. So we ended up with the very first MKE2 microphone on around the helmets, actually, of the trains in Starlight. And on that show, and it became an issue subsequently as well, there was too much output level from the microphone for the transmitter. And it was very hard to get around the issue on Starlight Express because the Micron transmitters that were used in the day were a kind of sealed unit. You couldn't really get in there. Someone at Autograph Tony, I think, I'm getting a nod, at Autograph, developed a little pad he was able to put in the connector to help us. It was a bit of a balancing act because the more you padded it down, the more you stopped the voltage getting to the capsule, so that started to overload. Anyway, issues of compatibility really with the tiny microphones and the transmitters.
And did you keep using iPro stuff into the future, or did you evolve? Did you keep using the same brand of radio mic then, or did you evolve into something else?
When I did Song and Dance in New York in 1986, early on in '86, we used some small Sennheiser transmitters. They were smaller, they're much smaller than the Microns, and we had the same issue. We had the MKE2 overdriving the first stage of the transmitter, but the Sennheiser USA boffins over there developed a pad they could put inside the transmitter, which stopped that happening. Because they could get inside the transmitter, they were able to do it so it didn't reduce the voltage the microphone needed for its capsule. And that worked really well. And then the next show we did with those mics was Phantom of the Opera in London in '86. Same microphone, same capsules, MKE2s, same transmitters, and
you got that working eventually, I imagine.
The guys, the Sennheiser factory didn't want to know, basically, about the pads. No, you can't overdrive it, We knew we could, so they didn't really want to know. So the UK Sennheiser guys asked for the pad information, the drawing.
And you faxed it over to them?
Well, the Sennheiser US people faxed the information over to the Sennheiser UK people, and they put them in the mics. Well, we got halfway through the previews, and I'm going, these mics are distorting so bad, what's going on? And I said to the guy, I can't remember his name, from Sennheiser UK, you've got the 8K2 resistors in, haven't you, in the transmitters? 1K2, he said. I said, no, 8K2, 1K2. What had happened was the fax, because it was a fax in the day, before emails, it was smudged, basically, and the 8 looked like a 1, so they got the pad completely wrong, so he changed it to the right pad, and all was fine.
Yeah.
So it was that was the headroom issue that I think you were mentioning with the tannoys, but it coincided with the tannoy show rather than the tannoys themselves.
I feel like a spaceship crashed into Mars for a similar reason, didn't it? Something to do with
get the number wrong. It's all going to go wrong.
Yeah.
There's a gentleman at the back frantically signalling to us that we have to stop.
Oh, well, we won't listen to what.
I'm going to say I feel so privileged to have had these two here, just like eavesdropping on this conversation that I expect normally happens over dinner. I'd like to do a traditional theatrical old-fashioned round of applause.
Well done, you.